I guess I'm speaking about myself in a confession. I fell in love with Paul rather than Jesus. I spent more time studying the writings of Paul than the writings of Jesus. I began to quote Paul more than Jesus. My God shall supply all of my needs. He who began a good work in you, he will bring it to completion. It is more blessed to give than receive. That's what Paul said, not Jesus. Paul was quoting Jesus, but he quoted differently, and we quote Paul rather than what Jesus said. I'm getting to a point here. Let me warn you about Paul. I want to warn you about Paul. Now, Paul is a very, and probably the most important apostolic authority in church doctrine. More important than Peter or James, John. These were the three pastors of the church in Rome, in Jerusalem rather. Peter, James, and John were the three top guys that Jesus left in charge. And Peter, of course, was the senior pastor. But they didn't talk much about doctrine. Peter didn't talk much about, correcting problems and dealing with issues. When you read Paul, you must be careful. I'm trying to choose my words carefully because I'm dealing with tender minds. When you read Paul, you must be careful because Paul's writings are not necessarily writings to communicate the gospel. When you read Paul's writings, and Paul's writings include 1st and 2nd Corinthians, Colossians, Galatians, Ephesians, Philippians, Timothy, Titus, Thessalonians, Philemon. These writings are not intended to teach you about the gospel. It's very important. These writings, if you study Paul's writings, 80% or more of them were written to address problems that the people who were already in the kingdom were having. So Paul's writings are really concerning with living in the kingdom rather than the kingdom itself. Do you understand? Are you sure you understand? So when you read Paul's writings, don't look primarily for the gospel. If you want to understand Jesus and if you want to understand his message, you must focus on Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. If you don't, you will end up being doctrine heavy and kingdom shallow. Are you understanding what I'm saying? This is very, very serious because I fell into the trap. I spent more time reading Paul's doctrinal letters than I did reading the mind of Jesus from his own words. And I became what they call in theology a Pauline apostle. What's a Pauline apostle? A Pauline convert. Someone who thinks more like Paul than Jesus. And most believers in the evangelical churches and in the traditional churches are converts of Paul rather than Jesus. And you're sitting next to one right now. Now, it's important to correct this because when you read Paul's writing, remember, you got to approach them from the point of view that Paul is not intending to focus on the gospel. So in the book of 1 Corinthians, which is the first book that Paul wrote, listed here in the canon, of course, Paul is dealing with what? Problems in the church in Corinth. Corinth was a town where he started a church. And in that church, they had a lot of problems. And if you read the book of Corinth, Paul's talking a lot about sex and about morality and about homosexuality and about incest and long hair and short hair, and he's doing all these things. Why? Because these people came out of a situation where they were mostly prostitutes. Corinth was the capital of the Roman worship of the god Eros, where we get our word erotic from, where we get our word erotica from, where we get our word fleshly sex. That was a god in Corinth. And Paul went there, and that city was filled with homosexuals and lesbians and prostitutes, because it had the capital temple of the worship of the sex goddess. Do you understand that? That's where everybody went to worship, in the act of sex. It was actually a cult where sex was the way you worship. So when you read the book of 1 Corinthians, Paul is dealing with people who got converted, but they still had their habits coming into the church, had their old lifestyle, they had the dress and everything. So Paul said, look, Paul said, look, you can't live like that anymore. And they didn't understand spiritual maturity, so they used to, even when they got baptized in the Holy Spirit, they spoke in tongues. They used to use it to show their spirituality. They would actually compete to see who could speak in tongues the longest and who could speak in tongues the loudest, and those who prophesied, they'd compete with other person's prophecy, and Paul says, no, don't do that. So when you read the book, you see him correcting that. No, don't do that, don't do that, don't do that. He's correcting. You understand? Are you sure you understand? So when you read the writings of Paul, you don't really want to search them to find the message of the gospel. What you're going to find in them is the lifestyle of the kingdom, the culture of the kingdom. Am I clear? I'm setting you up because I want you to understand how this book ends.